So let's take apart the Instalock remote control so that we can do some external switches. I know that folks have already done this already, but I thought I'd document it just so that we all have it and so that a year from now when I forget, I'll be able to remember. First thing you do is there are 4 little Phillips screws on the back of it. Just unscrew those and the unit comes apart like that. It's got the battery in place with the thing. Now, since we're doing this with an external power source, we aren't going to use the coin cell, so use it for something else. And then you have the main board, and you have this black wire, which is the antenna. And for the purposes of this, they actually have the antenna hooked around as a loop of metal there. I'm going to cut that off so I don't have to deal with this. Whoops. There we go. Got rid of that. If we need a longer antenna, we could always solder in a longer piece of wire. I have to check the frequency on this, but this is probably like a 1/8 or a 1/16 wave antenna, if they even bothered to do that. Okay, so here's the unit, and here's how we've been converting it. On the battery side, fortunately, there are 2 pads, one pad right there and one pad right there that are labeled K1 and K2. So those are the 2 switches, and they're labeled on this side also K1 and K2. So we're going to tie into there. That's about the easiest point. And then for ground, we've got 2 options. Well, actually, we have a couple options. This right here is a ground. If you look, it's got a via to the other side, and that's ground. So we could tie a ground wire into there if we wanted to. And then handily next to the LED, there is a point for positive. So we can do positive in and negative by tying into those points. We also have another option for ground, and that is we could, all of this around here is a ground plane because this is the ground of the cell. So for the external switches, I could tack solder some wires here to get it ground for those, because the 2 external switches will need a ground, and then they'll need to be tied to K1 and K2. So let me go over to my soldering station and put little blobs of solder on here. So the next step that I did to convert this board, or to get it ready for conversion, is I put little tack spots of solder at the places that I'm going to connect to. Now, there's actually more here than you really need, but there's a method to my madness. So there's one for K1, K2, which you know you have, one for positive, which you have, and then this is the ground. So I'm treating these as my power input and ground. And I also tacked on 2 more here on the ground plane. I could do this because we aren't going to use the lithium cell at all. But I did this because I want to have a dedicated ground for each of the 2 switches. Now that's more of a personal choice than anything else, but it also allows me that if I have a problem with one jack or another jack for some reason, it kind of separates it out and just makes future debugging hopefully a little bit easier. So to tack solder these, I used some alcohol-based flux and made sure everything was nice and clean, and then apply heat to the pad and a little drop of solder. They just end up being little balls of solder. You could try doing this square one for ground, but it gets a little close to that switch, so I decided not to do that. On these 2 points, you're going to have to heat it up a little bit more to get the solder to take. So make sure your rosin and your solder is flowing, and it'll take. So that preps it. So now at this point, I'll be able to actually put the wires in place. And with this, I'll lay a wire, hold it in place, hit it with the iron, and it'll stay in place in theory. Now, one thing that really kind of scared me and really annoyed me because I try to keep my soldering clean, is I saw what they did with this antenna lead. This is right out of the box, and this is absolutely awful. There's a huge solder blob there. The insulation is melted away, and this whole quadrant of the board has been overheated. I mean, if you want to introduce problems into things, this is like ding, 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 big red flag right there. Now, hopefully this thing actually works, but this is very, very poor assembly. This is absolutely atrocious assembly on this one. And I want to actually open up the other one and see what it looks like. Maybe I'll do that right now. Let me pause this. So here's fresh remote number 2. I just unscrewed it, and the battery has been shifted in place already. So this really wouldn't even be ready to go. You'd have to take this apart to put the battery in. So boo to that. And let's see if they did. See, now this is what I'm seeing more often on these boards, at least a couple that I've done. This solder point is not bad. It's pretty small. They got goo around here, which is probably a little bit of glue, but this has not been really badly overheated or anything. This guy's a mess. I'm going to redo this one. First, I'm going to make sure it actually works, because this might be enough to cause failure. But this other one is more typical, so that's good. We got one weirdo and one that I'm used to seeing with these remotes. So there we go. So the tack thing I'll do on this one also, but before I do that, let me finish wiring up this guy. So now we have our little octopus put together here. I've soldered in the leads, and these are I think 6-centimeter leads I have. One thing these are 28 gauge silicone shielding. I use silicone wires exclusively because they're flexible, and the insulation does not burn away at soldering temperatures like you'll see at some other wires. So what I have here, I have the one switch with its dedicated ground here, and it's soldered into a jack, and the other switch over here has its dedicated ground and soldered to that jack. And then the black wire and the red wire here are for the power input, which will be eventually connected to a battery box, which I have to modify a little bit. The one other tip I want to throw out here, if you're having a hard time, and these are kind of hard to wire, my finger is very calloused, so I could hold it and hit the soldering iron pretty easily. I'm used to the heat. But one trick you could do is get some of this Loctite Fun-Tac mounting putty. It's like a blue plastic putty, and what I'll do sometimes, if I have a hard stuff that's moving around a lot, is I will put the wire in place and put the little bit of Fun-Tac there, and then do the soldering job, and it holds it real well. I use it especially, I don't have it, let's see if I have one over here. Yeah, I do. When I'm soldering these guys, what I'll do is I put the sensor in there. This is a different project, of course, and then I'll hold it like that, and it just holds everything in place far easier and nicer. So that's a little helpful hint there. So at this point, I've got these all wired up. I have to modify the battery case so the wire comes out of here instead of the side. And then all I'll do is solder these leads together and put some heat shrink tubing over them to protect it. I typically leave the entire length of this wire. I don't cut it back because I do have enough room to tuck it in the enclosure. And as I always say, it's easier to cut things shorter than to make things longer. So especially on early prototypes, I keep wires long. Later on, I'll adjust it as necessary. These could probably, they really only need to be about, maybe about that long or so.